Hola, bonjour, guten tag and paella to introduce you to the local language here at Uluru in the middle of Australia. Like many people, I'm passionate about the well-being of children. So I'd like to share some ideas on how to prevent harm to children and all family members when parents separate. I'd like to suggest that this involves nothing less than transforming how we all deal with and even think about family separation and divorce. If that sounds a bit challenging or grandiose or vague, or just harder than simply making a few changes to your local Family Law Act, I ask you to join me on a short journey. Over a century ago, government agencies here began removing Aboriginal children from their families to be educated and brought up in civilised white society. The policy, based on the prevailing ideology of the day, was not unique to Australia, and no doubt many who implemented it sincerely believed they were acting in the children's best interests. As if it wasn't enough for children to be denied contact with their own parents, many were taught that their parents were not good or even abusive. Many children were not allowed to speak their own language and were taught to reject or were turned against not just their own parents, but their entire culture. Some were even put into environments that were highly abusive and caused even further harm. Together, these children were to become known as the stolen generations. As a symbol both of Australia and of Aboriginal culture, Uluru stands testament to that history and its consequences. High rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress and suicide, poor lifetime health, the loss of connection between children and their parents and culture, the despair and grief of parents and other close family members who lost their children. And on top of all of that, the consequent intergenerational trauma that affects so many families to this day. It's a story of a system we told ourselves for decades was doing good. But it wasn't. It was causing great harm. And it's worthwhile considering briefly how this could possibly have happened. Like many government interventions, it was based not on scientific evidence, but on ideology, the climate of the era, or zeitgeist, if you will. Rarely do governments move ahead of the times, or in advance of changes in culture and attitudes, an important lesson for any advocate of change. Also, typical of such interventions, it was costly, reactive, and based on protocols and procedures and laws, not on human nature and needs. The fact that Aboriginal children were removed from their parents for much of an entire century also illustrates how traditions implemented by governments are so hard to change. How people within a system often fail to see that what they are doing may actually be harmful or wrong, even if well-intentioned. And how such interventions are often seemingly immune to feedback, scrutiny, or accountability, even if their outcomes are dire and self-evident. Ultimately, it was harmful because governments are not parents. Though we have both history and science to back us up, we really shouldn't need them. So obvious is the litany of harm that stems from recklessly removing children from their parents, from allowing families to be destroyed, from not preserving family ties. Plus ça change. Fast forward half a century to a world in which it's taken an international pandemic to remind us, above all things, of the importance of family and family relationships. In one survey last year, maintaining relationships with family was rated more important than keeping a job or even putting food on the table. And yet, despite this timely reminder, it seems we haven't learnt what we could from the past. Around 1970, just as we were stopping policies of removing First Nations children from parents, we began establishing government-run, law-based systems in Australia and around the world to facilitate and manage the escalating numbers of family separations. Family courts had arrived. And with the very best of intentions, once more, they were to look after the best interests of children. So, how has that been working out? Well, today, up to a third of all children in some countries experience the divorce or separation of their parents. It's still the subject of stigma and not really a topic of polite dinner party conversation. And many children are harmed for life during a process that leaves them in unhealthy or unsafe situations or loses them important loving relationships, or both. This is particularly true for the large numbers of children turned against their own parent or family. If children are taught to hate their own flesh and blood, that's exactly what they begin to do, often with tragic consequences. So, even prior to COVID, we have evidence of escalating self-harming behaviours and mental health issues in ever younger people. We have disturbing rates of suicide in young people and adults. We even have unthinkable acts of family violence, children being murdered by their own parents. And, all too often, we see direct links with family breakups. We now have large studies too that increasingly show the connection between adverse childhood experiences, including family breakups, higher risks of harm, and diminished lifetime health. And we even have science that shows us what happens to neurons in children's brains when exposed to extreme or prolonged stress, like family separation. In many countries, this major social issue of families breaking up has become a public health crisis. So, what should we be doing to prevent children being left in abusive environments, to prevent children from being wrongly cut off from or turned against parents, to prevent children and their parents from dying young? And, rather than trying to stop one form of harm alone, are there measures that could prevent them all? Whatever percentage of parents actually engage in court proceedings, family courts are the best funded and best known system in many countries. And yet, from the UK to Australia, top family court judges are increasingly questioning whether separating families belong in courts at all. For all the dedicated work of good judges, lawyers and court experts, is a legal process, especially if adversarial, unaffordable or stressful, the best and most compassionate way to be dealing with what is, in fact, a health and social issue for families often at their most vulnerable. Now, I realise that many folk at the front line today can see how their work within the current system helps many. Some will even speak of how courts and court orders are essential for them to be able to carry out their work. But is this actually prevention of harm or merely harm reduction? And at what cost? It's a matter of logic and evidence that the terrifyingly high stakes and high pressure of most court systems actually makes it more likely for parents to use their children as weapons against the other parent. After all, that's by far the most powerful and accessible tool they've got, especially given the power we're increasingly giving to young children's voices. If we look at the most horrific outcomes of family breakups too, we find a particularly disturbing pattern, one that's repeated in many countries. In Australia, every 2 weeks another child is murdered by a parent or close family member. And one of the leading common denominators is not location or gender, but family breakups. Actually, to be more precise, it's family court proceedings. It was the day after court proceedings and a particularly adverse court expert's report that Arthur Freeman dropped his 4-year-old daughter Darcy to her death from the Westgate Bridge in Melbourne, Australia. Just 8 months earlier, 2-year-old Oliver was killed by his mother, Gabriela Garcia, when she jumped with him from that same bridge, allegedly out of fear of family court proceedings that might take young Oliver away from her. Fear that was perhaps not unreasonable, given that close to 90% of judicial determinations result effectively in single-parent families. And it was the night before a family court hearing in the nation's capital, Canberra, that Anne Mahoro poisoned young Esvin and Faraha before burning down the house with them all still in it. Tragically, the list is much longer. One further murder-suicide was examined by the West Australian coroner, who stated, The evidence makes clear that parties to family court proceedings can be subjected to intense ongoing stress. It is also clear that such stress was a contributing, if not precipitating, factor. Why would we want to put anyone through that? If there are no pre-existing risk factors like mental health issues or proneness to addiction or violence, stressful court proceedings seem inappropriate at best. If there are such factors, though, allowing these families to enter such a system seems positively reckless. This chart illustrates the relative and potential effectiveness of different types of approaches. For a start, we can of course improve our legislation. After all, laws set the tone for family separations throughout the land. But ultimately, this is only a tiny fraction of the solution. Small changes can take years to accomplish. And in Australia, a staggering 110 separate acts of Parliament in just 45 years have still failed to get the Family Law Act right. Improving family law practices can be simpler, quicker and more effective. By making faster decisions, for instance. In parts of Belgium and Israel, decisions appear to be made in 3 weeks that would often take 3 years in some other jurisdictions. By requiring better training, so that, for instance, all professionals can recognise all forms of child maltreatment, and all decision makers know that removing a child from someone who loves and cares for them, or allowing the child to be denied access, can be at least as harmful and just as unsafe as leaving a child in the care of someone alleged to be abusive. We need to recognise, though, that educating professionals to identify and treat something better means, by definition, that we've failed to prevent it. Furthermore, in many jurisdictions, the very act of getting a lawyer and entering a court system sets a family firmly on a dangerous trajectory. Avoidable harm has already begun. More effective still, in many countries, would be the introduction of modern arbitration. It's generally quicker, cheaper, and more effective than more cumbersome court systems, for both financial and children's matters. To quote one UK High Court judge, it's a no-brainer. Even more effective and earlier are various forms of mediation or enhanced conciliation. At its best, with experienced proactive conciliators and substantial guidance for parents before they take part, this process can leave parents in control of decisions while still reaching an outcome that's good for children, and importantly, that both parents will buy into. If we're really talking about prevention, though, prevention of harm to children, our main focus must start even earlier, with local and affordable support readily available for all children and families, whether through schools, community centres, churches or healthcare centres, long before families are in crisis and in an environment that doesn't escalate pressure, tension, hostility and risks. One of my colleagues, Karen, gets called in, for instance, when a teacher notices a problem with a child at school. The parents are contacted and, invariably, are both happy to come in and benefit from the coaching Karen provides. It's in the very nature of such early interventions that you don't know exactly what you're preventing down the track, whether family violence or damaging breakups. But that, ironically, is the real test of truly preventative measures. You often can't give a label to what you prevented. Finally, and most importantly for true prevention, comes education. Education of separating parents before they get involved in legal proceedings, so they fully understand the needs of and potential harm to children. Education of young parents long before they have such troubles, and of young people and even school children. So much can be accomplished so much more effectively and cost-effectively with the right education about healthy relationships, building resilience, or the harm to children if you separate badly. Even if we could all agree what prevention actually looks like, though, and put all such measures in place, we'd still be missing arguably the most important ingredient. Some of you will know the old line, "If you build it, they will come." Actually, Kevin Costner says he will come, but no matter. But it's not true, except in the movies perhaps. The most important element of all in prevention is not to identify and implement these measures, though this is essential, but to promote them with carefully crafted policies to politicians and with carefully crafted messages that will reach the public at large. This is the campaign that we've taken on at the Two Wishes Foundation. Our vision is a positive one of a world where all children are free to maintain and develop positive relationships with all who love and care for them, whatever shape their family takes. Our mission is to build healthier families and ensure that children are not harmed when parents split up or families change. We aim to create a paradigm shift and get the world to reimagine family breakups, perhaps even to reimagine family as a living network of interconnecting and loving relationships with a child at its centre. A good campaign has many coordinated components. Among ours, we're using our in-house expertise to produce TV programmes for international television. Programmes that will play a central role in an extensive and professionally produced social impact campaign. We're producing TV ads for mainstream television and social media around the globe. Our first, No Child Should Have to Choose, has already been filmed and will be launched internationally next year. Our themes are chosen carefully to influence critical behaviours or highlight key issues. We're generating mainstream media coverage on TV, radio and in print media that will reach a mainstream audience with key messages and calls to action. In Australia, we've reached 10 to 20% of the entire population already. We're listening to children and young people and creating comprehensive, inclusive policies that politicians and legislators can embrace. For there's no point in motivating the world to act if no one knows what action needs to be taken. And we're liaising with and trying to bring together groups and organisations around the world who share our vision and our aims. So you're welcome to make contact with us. We have a positive message about brighter futures for children, even those who missed out on their first wish to grow up in a healthy, happy family. And we've developed detailed policies and strategies for getting there. This is what we think is needed for prevention of harm to children and families. And it's so much better than any cure. Thank you.